I was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, my mind wandering to the events of the past few years. It's funny how life can change so drastically in such a short time. I remember when I thought I had it all: a loving husband, a fulfilling career as a journalist, and dreams of starting a family. But as they say, appearances can be deceiving. My name is Sophia Anderson, and I'm 33 years old. I was married to Eric, a 35-year-old university professor, for 6 years. We didn't have kids, but we'd been talking about adoption. I thought we were happy, you know? I really did. I remember the day I realized something was off. It was a Tuesday, and I just finished a big story I'd been working on for weeks. I was so excited to share the news with Eric, but when I got home, he barely looked up from his phone. "Hey, honey," I said, practically bouncing with excitement. Guess what? The expose on the city council corruption finally got approved. It's going to be the front page story tomorrow. Eric glanced up, his eyes unfocused. "Oh, that's great, Soph. Really great." Then he went right back to typing on his phone. I felt my smile falter. "Is everything okay?" I asked, moving closer to him. He startled, quickly locking his phone screen. Yeah, just work stuff. You know how it is." I nodded, but something felt off. Eric had always been so supportive of my work, always wanting to hear every detail. This cold response was new, and it left an uneasy feeling in the pit of my stomach. That night, as we lay in bed, I tried to shake off the weird vibe. "So, I was thinking," I said, turning to face him, "maybe we could start looking into adoption agencies this weekend. I found a few that look promising." Eric tensed beside me. "This weekend, I can't. I have to prepare for a big lecture next week, maybe another time." I frowned. "But you said last month that we'd start looking in March. It's already mid-April." He sighed, rolling away from me. I know. Things have just been crazy at the university lately. Can we talk about this later?" I felt a lump forming in my throat. "Sure," I whispered, but he was already pretending to be asleep. As I lay there in the dark, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was changing between us. Eric had always been my rock, my biggest supporter. Now, it felt like he was slipping away, and I didn't know why. The next morning, I woke up early and made Eric's favorite breakfast: blueberry pancakes with real maple syrup. I thought maybe I could reconnect with him over a nice meal before work. "Wow, this looks amazing," Eric said as he rushed into the kitchen, already dressed for work. "But I can't stay. I have an early meeting with the department head." "Oh," I said, trying to hide my disappointment. "I thought maybe we could have breakfast together, like we used to." Eric paused, looking genuinely regretful. "I'm sorry, Soph. How about we do dinner tonight instead? I'll cook." I brightened at that. "Really, that would be great." He smiled, kissed me on the cheek, and headed for the door. "It's a date. See you tonight." As I watched him leave, I felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe I was just being paranoid. Maybe things would get better. Little did I know that hope was about to be shattered in ways I couldn't even imagine. That evening, I got home early, excited for our dinner date. But as I walked in, I was met with darkness and silence. No delicious smells coming from the kitchen. No sign of Eric. I checked my phone, thinking maybe he texted to say he'd be late. Nothing. An hour passed, then 2. I called his office, but no answer. I tried his cell, but it went straight to voicemail. Finally, around 9 p.m., I heard the key in the lock. Eric stumbled in, looking disheveled and smelling faintly of alcohol. "Where have you been?" I asked, my voice shaking with a mix of relief and anger. "I've been worried sick." Eric blinked at me, confusion evident on his face. "What do you mean? I told you I had a late faculty meeting." I stared at him in disbelief. "No, you didn't. You said you'd cook dinner tonight. We had plans, Eric." He ran a hand through his hair, looking flustered. "Oh God, Sophia, I'm so sorry, I completely forgot. The meeting ran late, and then some of us went for drinks, and I'm sorry. I wanted to be angry, to yell at him for forgetting, for not calling. But the look of genuine remorse on his face made me pause. Maybe he really did just forget. It's okay, I said softly even though it wasn't. Ius, these things happen. Just, please call next time, okay? He nodded, pulling me into a hug. I promise, I'm really sorry, Soph. As I hugged him back, I couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something wasn't right. The Eric I knew would never have forgotten our plans, would never have let me worry like that, but I pushed those thoughts aside. After all, we all make mistakes, right? I had no idea then that this was just the beginning of a series of events that would turn my world upside down. After that night, I tried to convince myself that everything was fine, but you know that feeling when you just know something's off? Yeah, that's what I was dealing with. It was like this constant itch at the back of my mind that I couldn't quite scratch. I started noticing little things, like how Eric would always turn his phone face down when I walked into the room, or how he'd suddenly go quiet if I came home while he was on a call. At first, I thought maybe I was just being paranoid. I mean, we all need our privacy, right? But then there was this one night that really got me thinking. We were cuddled up on the couch, watching a movie. Well, I was watching. Eric was glued to his phone as usual. Suddenly, his phone pinged with a message notification. I glanced over, not meaning to snoop, but curious. The name that flashed up was Sarah, with a little heart emoji next to it. Who's Sarah? I asked, trying to keep my voice casual. Eric practically jumped, fumbling with his phone. Oh, just a new grad student. She's working on a project with me. I raised an eyebrow. I'm with a heart emoji. He laughed, but it sounded forced. Oh, you know how kids are these days. They put emojis on everything. I wanted to believe him. I really did. But something about the way he said it just didn't sit right with me. The next day, I decided to surprise Eric at work. I picked up lunch from his favorite deli and headed to his office. As I approached, I could hear his voice through the partially open door. He was laughing, that deep, genuine laugh I hadn't heard in ages. No, you're absolutely right, I heard him say. Listen, I've got to go, but I'll see you later, okay? Can't wait. My heart sank. I knew that tone. It was the same one he used to use with me when we were first dating. I knocked on the door, plastering a smile on my face. Eric's eyes widened when he saw me. Sophia, what are you doing here? I held up the lunch bag. Thought I'd surprise you with lunch. Hope I'm not interrupting anything? He shook his head quickly. No, of course not. Just wrapping up a call with a colleague. This is great. Thanks, honey. We ate lunch together, but it felt strained. Eric kept checking his phone, and I couldn't shake the feeling that he'd rather be talking to someone else. As the weeks went by, Eric's behavior became more and more erratic. He started working late more often, claiming he had extra classes or faculty meetings. But when I'd casually mention his late nights to his colleagues at university events, they'd look confused. Extra classes, one of them said once. But Eric's teaching load was actually reduced this semester. I felt like I was going crazy. Was I reading too much into things? Was I becoming one of those paranoid, clingy wives I'd always rolled my eyes at? But then came the night that really set alarm bells ringing. Eric had told me he had a late faculty meeting, so I decided to catch up on some work. Around midnight, I realized I'd left some important notes in his home office. I hesitated outside the door. Eric always kept it locked these days, claiming he had sensitive student information, but I knew where he kept the spare key. I debated for a moment, then made a decision. I needed those notes. And besides, what harm could come from going into my husband's office? As I opened the drawer of his desk, looking for my notes, a small black notebook caught my eye. I knew I shouldn't look, but something compelled me to open it. Inside, I found lists of dates and times, along with cryptic notes like S, coffee, 3 p.m., or L, dinner, 8 p.m. My heart started racing. These weren't work appointments. These were dates. I heard the front door open and quickly shoved the notebook back in the drawer, grabbing my notes and rushing out. As I passed Eric in the hallway, he frowned. "What were you doing in my office?" I held up my notes, trying to keep my voice steady. "Just grabbing these. Sorry, I know I should have asked first." He nodded, but I could see the suspicion in his eyes. "It's fine, just please ask next time, okay?" As I lay in bed that night, listening to Eric's steady breathing beside me, my mind was racing. What was in that notebook? Who were S and L? And most importantly, what was happening to my marriage? I wanted to confront Eric, to demand answers, but a part of me was terrified of what those answers might be. So instead, I lay there in silence, feeling the distance between us grow with every passing second. Little did I know, this was just the beginning. The Eric I thought I knew was slipping away, and I was about to embark on a journey that would test everything I thought I knew about love, trust, and my own strength. After that night in Eric's office, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was seriously wrong. It was like a fog had lifted, and suddenly I was seeing everything in a new, harsh light. Every late night, every canceled plan, every secretive phone call, it all started to add up to a picture I really didn't want to see. I remember sitting at our kitchen table one morning, clutching my coffee mug like a lifeline, when Eric rushed in. He was buttoning up his shirt, looking flustered. "Sorry, can't do breakfast," he said, not even looking at me. "Got an early meeting." I frowned. "Again?" "That's the third time this week." He paused, finally meeting my eyes. "Yeah, well, you know how it is at the end of the semester. Lots of grading, student meetings." I nodded slowly. "Right, of course." As he headed for the door, I called out, "Hey, don't forget we have dinner with my parents tonight." Eric froze, his hand on the doorknob. "Oh, Sophia, I'm so sorry. I completely forgot. I've got a late faculty meeting tonight. Can we reschedule?" I felt my heart sink. "Eric, we've had this planned for weeks. My mom's been looking forward to it." He ran a hand through his hair, looking genuinely distressed. I know. I'm really sorry. It's just, this meeting is really important. I can't reschedule it." I wanted to argue, to point out that he'd been doing this more and more lately, but instead I just nodded. "Fine, I'll let them know." As the door closed behind him, I felt tears prickling at the corners of my eyes. This wasn't like Eric. I'd always loved spending time with my family. What was going on? That night, as I sat at my parents' dinner table, picking at my food and trying to explain Eric's absence, my mom gave me a long, searching look. "Honey," she said gently, "is everything okay with you and Eric?" I forced a smile. "Of course, Mom. Why wouldn't it be?" She reached across the table, squeezing my hand. "It's just, you seem distant lately. And Eric's been missing a lot of our family gatherings." I felt a lump forming in my throat. "He's just been really busy with work. You know how it is." My dad snorted. "Busy, Sophia. When I was working, I never missed a single family dinner. Not one." "Dad, please," I said, feeling defensive despite myself. "Academia is different. There's a lot of pressure." But even as I said it, I couldn't help but wonder, was it really just work? The next day, I decided to surprise Eric at his office again. I told myself it was just to bring him lunch, but deep down, I knew I was hoping to catch something, anything that would explain his behavior. As I approached his office, I heard voices, Eric's, and a woman's. They were laughing about something. I hesitated outside the door, my hand raised to knock. Then I heard the woman say, "Oh, Eric, you're terrible," in a tone that was definitely not professional. My heart pounding, I knocked on the door. There was a sudden scrambling sound, and then Eric's voice called out, "Just a minute." When the door opened, Eric looked flushed. Behind him, I could see a young woman, probably in her mid-20s, gathering up some papers. "Sophia," Eric said, his voice a little too bright. What are you doing here? I held up the lunch bag, trying to keep my voice steady. Thought I'd surprise you with lunch. Am I interrupting something? Eric shook his head quickly. No, Sarah and I were just going over her thesis proposal. Sarah, this is my wife, Sophia. Sarah smiled at me, but it didn't reach her eyes. Nice to meet you, Mrs. Anderson. I've heard so much about you. I forced a smile. Funny, I can't say the same. An awkward silence fell over the room. Finally, Eric cleared his throat. Well, Sarah, I think we're done for today. Why don't you email me those revisions and we'll meet again next week? As Sarah gathered her things and left, I couldn't help but notice the way her hand lingered on Eric's arm as she said goodbye, or the way Eric's eyes followed her as she walked away. Once we were alone, Eric turned to me with a strained smile. So, lunch? That's great, honey. I'm starving. But as we sat there, picking at our sandwiches and making small talk, I couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had shifted. The easy companionship we'd always shared felt forced, like we were both playing roles in a play neither of us wanted to be in. That night, as I lay awake listening to Eric's steady breathing beside me, I made a decision. I couldn't go on like this, constantly doubting and second-guessing. I needed answers. Little did I know, the path to those answers would lead me down a road I never thought I'd have to travel. In the harsh light of day, I knew what I had to do. It was time to put my investigative skills to use. As I heard Eric getting ready for work, I called out, "Hey, honey, I think I'm coming down with something. I might stay home today." Eric poked his head into the bedroom, looking concerned. "Are you okay? Do you need me to stay home with you?" I waved him off, trying to look pitiful. No, I'll be fine. You go to work. I'll just rest." As soon as I heard the front door close, I sprang into action. I felt a twinge of guilt for lying, but I pushed it aside. If Eric was being honest with me, I wouldn't need to do this. First stop, Eric's home office. I knew he kept it locked, but I also knew where he hid the spare key. As I turned the key in the lock, my heart was pounding so loud I was sure the neighbors could hear it. Inside, everything looked normal at first glance, but I wasn't here for a casual look. I started with his desk drawers, rifling through papers and folders. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary until I came across that little black notebook I'd seen before. With shaking hands, I opened it. There were more entries now, more cryptic notes. S. Park, 2 p.m. L. Dinner, 8 p.m. A. Coffee, 11 a.m. My stomach churned. These weren't work appointments. These were dates. I grabbed my phone and started taking pictures of the pages. Evidence, I told myself. I needed evidence. Next, I turned to his computer. It was password protected, of course, but I knew Eric. I tried our anniversary date. Nothing. His birth date. Nope. Then, on a hunch, I tried Sarah's name. Bingo. As the desktop loaded, I felt a mix of triumph and dread. What would I find here? Did I really want to know? I started with his email. Most of it seemed innocuous. Work correspondence, spam, newsletters. But then I saw a folder labeled personal. My finger hovered over the mouse pad. Did I dare? Before I could decide, I heard a noise downstairs. Footsteps. My heart leapt into my throat. Eric wasn't supposed to be home for hours. Panicking, I quickly closed everything, making sure to leave everything exactly as I'd found it. I rushed out of the office, locking the door behind me, and dove back into bed just as I heard Eric's voice. "Sophia, you awake?" I feigned grogginess. "Eric, what are you doing home?" He came into the bedroom, looking sheepish. "I was worried about you. Thought I'd come check on you during my lunch break. How are you feeling?" The concern in his voice made my chest ache. For a moment, I almost confessed everything. But then I remembered the notebook, the secret email folder. I'm okay. Just tired." Eric nodded, placing a hand on my forehead. "You don't feel warm. Maybe it's just a 24-hour bug." I managed a weak smile. "Yeah, maybe. You should get back to work. I'll be fine." After Eric left, I lay in bed, my mind whirling. What had I almost discovered in that email folder? And more importantly, what was I going to do now? That evening, as Eric and I sat at the dinner table, the tension was palpable. Every time he glanced at his phone, I wondered who he was thinking about. Every time he mentioned work, I questioned if it was really work he was talking about. "So," I said, trying to keep my voice casual, "how's Sarah's thesis coming along?" Eric's fork paused halfway to his mouth. "Sarah, your grad student," I prompted. "The one I met in your office the other day?" "Oh, right," he said, his voice carefully neutral. It's coming along. Why do you ask?" I shrugged, pushing my food around my plate. "Just curious." "She seemed nice," Eric nodded, not meeting my eyes. "Yeah, she's a good student, very dedicated." The conversation lapsed into an uncomfortable silence. I wanted to scream, to demand answers, but I knew I needed more evidence, more certainty. That night, as Eric slept beside me, I made a plan. I'd use every skill I had as a journalist to get to the bottom of this. I'd track his movements, check his phone records, maybe even follow him if I had to. The thought made me sick. This wasn't who I was. I'd always believed in trust, in open communication. But Eric had changed the rules of our relationship, and now I had to adapt. As I drifted off to sleep, one thought kept circling in my mind. What if I find out something I can't unknow? What if the truth destroys everything? But I pushed those fears aside. I deserved the truth, no matter how painful it might be, and I was going to get it, one way or another. Little did I know, my investigation was about to lead me down a path that would change my life forever. A path that would test my strength, my resolve, and everything I thought I knew about love and trust. But in that moment, as I lay there in the dark, listening to the steady breathing of the man I thought I knew, all I felt was a grim determination. Whatever the truth was, I was going to find it, and I was going to face it head on. The next few weeks were a blur of sleepless nights and anxiety-filled days. I threw myself into my investigation, determined to uncover the truth about Eric's behavior, but for every clue I found, there seemed to be a perfectly innocent explanation. One day, I decided to follow Eric after he left for work. I felt ridiculous, like a character in some cheesy detective novel, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was missing something. I watched from my car as Eric pulled into the university parking lot. He walked into his building, briefcase in hand, looking every bit the respectable professor. Just as I was about to give up and go home, feeling foolish, I saw him emerge again. My heart raced as I watched him walk across campus. Was this it? Was I about to catch him in the act? But then I saw where he was headed, the campus coffee shop. I watched as he bought 2 coffees and headed back to his building. Maybe he was just being nice to a colleague, I told myself. It didn't have to mean anything. Later that week, I managed to get a look at Eric's phone while he was in the shower. My hands shook as I scrolled through his messages, but I found nothing incriminating. Just work emails, texts from colleagues, and a few messages from me. I put the phone down, feeling a mix of relief and frustration. Was I just being paranoid? Was I seeing problems where there weren't any? That night at dinner, Eric surprised me by suggesting we go away for the weekend. "I've been working too much lately," he said, reaching across the table to take my hand. "I miss spending time with you." I felt a lump in my throat. "Really? You're not too busy?" He shook his head, smiling. "Nothing's more important than us, Sophia. I'm sorry if I've made you feel otherwise lately." As we packed for our trip, I felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe things were going to be okay after all. Maybe I'd been wrong about everything. We spent the weekend at a cozy bed and breakfast in the countryside. For the first time in months, Eric seemed fully present. We talked, we laughed, we reconnected in ways I'd been missing. On our last night there, as we sat on the porch watching the sunset, Eric turned to me with a serious expression. "Sophia," he said, "I know things have been off between us lately, I want you to know that you're the most important person in my life. I love you more than anything." Tears welled up in my eyes. "I love you too, Eric. I've missed you." He pulled me close, and for a moment, everything felt right in the world. But as we drove home the next day, doubts started creeping back in. If everything was fine, why had Eric been acting so strange? Why the secret phone calls, the late nights, the mysterious appointments? I tried to push these thoughts aside, to focus on the good weekend we'd had, but they lingered, like a shadow at the edge of my vision. A few days after we got back, I was doing laundry when I found a receipt in Eric's pocket. It was for a fancy restaurant downtown, one we'd never been to together. The date on the receipt was from a night Eric had told me he was working late. My hands trembled as I stared at the piece of paper. It could be innocent, I told myself. Maybe he'd gone out with colleagues after work. Maybe it was a business dinner he'd forgotten to mention. But deep down, I knew. This was the proof I'd been looking for, the smoking gun I'd both dreaded and hoped to find. I confronted Eric that evening, my voice shaking as I held up the receipt. "Can you explain this?" Eric's face went pale. "Sophia, it's not what you think." "Then what is it, Eric?" I demanded, my voice rising. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you've been lying to me." He ran a hand through his hair, looking cornered. It was a dinner with a potential donor for the university. I didn't tell you because I didn't want you to worry about me working too much." I wanted to believe him. God, how I wanted to believe him. But something in his eyes, in the way he couldn't quite meet my gaze, told me he wasn't being entirely truthful. "A donor," I repeated flatly. "And this donor's name wouldn't happen to be Sarah, would it?" Eric's eyes widened in surprise, and I knew I'd hit a nerve. "Sophia, please, it's not like that. Sarah's just a student." "A student you have secret dinners with?" I shot back. "A student whose name is the password to your computer." As soon as the words left my mouth, I realized my mistake. Eric's expression hardened. "You went through my computer?" he asked, his voice dangerously quiet. I felt my cheeks burn with shame, but I stood my ground. "I had to, Eric. You've been lying to me, sneaking around. What was I supposed to think?" We argued late into the night, going in circles. Eric insisted there was nothing going on with Sarah or anyone else. I wanted to believe him, but the doubt had taken root too deeply. As I lay in bed that night, turned away from Eric's sleeping form, I felt more confused than ever. Had I just ruined our marriage over nothing? Or was Eric still hiding something? I closed my eyes, exhausted but unable to sleep. One thing was clear. This wasn't over, not by a long shot, and I had a sinking feeling that things were about to get a whole lot worse before they got better. After that night, things between Eric and me were tense, to say the least. We tiptoed around each other, both of us afraid to bring up the elephant in the room. But I couldn't let it go. The questions, the doubts, they gnawed at me day and night. I needed answers, real answers. And I was done playing nice. One morning, as Eric was getting ready for work, I casually mentioned, "Oh, by the way, I might stop by your office for lunch today. That okay?" Eric paused, toothbrush halfway to his mouth. "Today? I've got a pretty packed schedule. Maybe another time." I narrowed my eyes. "Too packed for lunch with your wife," he sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Sophia, please, let's not do this again." But I was done backing down. "Do what, Eric? Ask my husband to have lunch with me. When did that become such a problem?" Eric's shoulders slumped. "Fine. Come by around 1. I'll make time." As he left for work, I felt a mix of triumph and dread. What would I find at his office? I arrived at the university just before 1 p.m., my heart racing. As I approached Eric's office, I heard voices inside. I paused, my hand on the doorknob. "Eric, we can't keep doing this," a woman's voice said. My blood ran cold. I knew that voice. "Sarah." I know, Eric replied, his voice low and urgent. But we've come too far to stop now. I couldn't breathe. This was it. The proof I'd been looking for and dreading in equal measure. I burst into the office, my vision blurring with unshed tears. Too far to stop what, exactly? Eric and Sarah jumped apart, both looking guilty as hell. But as I blinked away the tears, I realized something didn't add up. The room was filled with papers, charts, and what looked like financial reports. "Sophia!" Eric exclaimed, his face a mix of shock and, was that relief? "What are you doing here?" I crossed my arms, trying to keep my voice steady. "You invited me for lunch, remember? But clearly you're busy with whatever this is." Sarah looked between us, her eyes wide. "Mrs. Anderson, I'm so sorry. We didn't mean to. It's not what it looks like." I laughed bitterly. "Oh, really? Because from where I'm standing, it looks like my husband is having an affair with his student." Eric stepped forward, his hands raised. "Sophia, no, it's not. God, this is such a mess. Sarah, can you give us a minute?" As Sarah hurried out, closing the door behind her, Eric turned to me with a pleading look. "Honey, I swear to you, I'm not having an affair with Sarah or anyone else." I wanted to believe him, but the secret meetings, the lies, the guilty looks. "Then what is all this, Eric? Why all the secrecy?" He sighed deeply, gesturing to the papers strewn across his desk. It's a whistleblowing case. We've uncovered some serious financial irregularities in the university's funding allocations. Embezzlement, fraud, the works. I blinked, trying to process this. "What? But why didn't you tell me?" Eric ran a hand through his hair, a gesture I recognized as a sign of his frustration. "I wanted to protect you. The people involved. They're powerful, Sophia. Dangerous, even. I didn't want you to worry or be at risk." I felt a mix of emotions wash over me, relief, anger, confusion. So all those late nights, the secret phone calls, all related to this investigation, Eric finished. "Sarah's been helping me compile evidence. That dinner you found the receipt for, it was with the potential whistleblower. I couldn't tell you, because the fewer people who knew, the safer everyone was." I sank into a chair, my legs suddenly weak. "Why didn't you trust me with this, Eric? I'm your wife. I'm a journalist, for God's sake. I could have helped." Eric knelt in front of me, taking my hands in his. "I'm so sorry, Sophia. I thought I was doing the right thing. I never meant to hurt you or make you doubt us." As the truth sank in, I felt a mix of relief and lingering anger. "You should have told me, Eric. We're supposed to be partners." He nodded, looking remorseful. "I know, I messed up. Can you forgive me?" I looked into his eyes, seeing the sincerity there. But before I could respond, Sarah burst back into the office, her face pale. "Eric, we've got a problem," she said urgently. "Someone's been in the system. They know we're onto them." Eric's face drained of color. He turned to me, his expression grave. "Sophia, I need you to listen carefully. Things are about to get very complicated and potentially dangerous. I need you to go home, pack a bag, and wait for my call. Can you do that?" I stood up, my journalistic instincts kicking in. "Like hell I will. I'm in this now, Eric. Whether you like it or not." He looked like he wanted to argue, but then nodded. "Okay, but you need to know, once we go down this road, there's no turning back. Are you sure?" I took a deep breath, squaring my shoulders. "I'm sure. We're in this together." As we huddled around Eric's desk, poring over documents and forming a plan, I felt a strange mix of emotions. Relief that Eric wasn't cheating, anger that he kept me in the dark, and a growing sense of excitement at the story unfolding before me. Little did I know, this was just the beginning. The road ahead would be fraught with danger, betrayal, and revelations that would shake the very foundation of our lives. But in that moment, as I stood shoulder to shoulder with my husband, ready to face whatever came our way, I felt something I hadn't felt in months. Hope. The next few days were a whirlwind of activity. Eric, Sarah, and I worked tirelessly, combing through financial records, emails, and meeting minutes. The more we uncovered, the more horrified I became. They're going to great lengths to keep it hidden. Sarah, who was sprawled on the floor surrounded by papers, sat up suddenly. Guys, I think I found something. Remember that dinner receipt you found, Sophia? The one that made you suspect Eric? I nodded, feeling a twinge of guilt at the memory. Sarah continued, Well, I cross-referenced the date with the university's event calendar. There was a private fundraiser that night at the same restaurant. Eric's eyes widened. The potential whistleblower I met, he must have been there. But why would he risk being seen with me at such a public event? I felt a chill run down my spine. Unless he wasn't the whistleblower at all. What if it was a setup? The room fell silent as the implications of my words sank in. Eric paled visibly. If that's true, then they've known about our investigation from the start. We could be in serious danger. As if on cue, my phone buzzed with a text. It was from an unknown number, but the message made my blood run cold. Back off, or else. I showed it to Eric and Sarah, my hand shaking slightly. Eric immediately sprang into action, grabbing his keys. We need to get out of here, now. It's not safe. We hastily packed up our evidence and piled into Eric's car. As we drove through the darkened streets, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Where are we going? I asked. Glancing nervously out the back window, Eric's grip tightened on the steering wheel. I have a friend who owns a cabin in the mountains. We'll be safe there while we figure out our next move. The drive was tense and silent. Every set of headlights behind us made me jump. By the time we arrived at the cabin, I was a bundle of nerves. As we settled in, Sarah pulled out her laptop. I managed to download a copy of the university's secure server before we left. If there's any smoking gun evidence, it'll be in here. We spent the next few hours poring over the files. The more we uncovered, the more complex and sinister the whole thing became. It wasn't just the university involved. There were connections to local politicians, business leaders, even hints of international money laundering. This is bigger than we thought, Eric muttered, running a hand through his hair. Way bigger. I nodded, feeling a mix of fear and excitement. This was the kind of story journalists dream about, a chance to expose corruption at the highest levels. But at what cost? As dawn broke, Sarah let out a gasp. Oh my God. Guys, look at this. We crowded around her screen. There, in black and white, was an email chain discussing neutralizing potential threats. And at the top of the list of names was Eric's. They're going to try to silence us, I whispered, my voice shaking. Eric pulled me close, his face grim. And we won't let them. We have the truth on our side. But even as he said it, I could see the fear in his eyes. We were in way over our heads, and we all knew it. Suddenly, Sarah's laptop pinged with an incoming email. It was from an encrypted address, with just 2 words in the subject line, help coming. We looked at each other, a mix of hope and suspicion on our faces. Was this a lifeline or another trap? Before we could discuss it, we heard the sound of tires on gravel outside. Eric peered out the window, his body tense. There's a car coming up the drive, black SUV, no plates. My heart raced. Friend or foe? Eric shook his head. No way to know. Quick, gather everything. We might need to make a run for it. As we scrambled to pack up our evidence, I couldn't help but think about how much my life had changed in just a few short days. From suspecting my husband of cheating to being on the run from corrupt officials, it was like something out of a movie. The sound of footsteps on the porch made us all freeze. There was a knock at the door, followed by a voice that made my jaw drop. Eric, Sophia, it's me, Dean Hawthorne. We need to talk. Eric and I exchanged shocked looks. The dean of the university was the last person we expected to show up here. Should we open it? Sarah whispered. Eric hesitated, then nodded. He might be our only chance to make sense of all this. As Eric reached for the doorknob, I held my breath. Whatever was on the other side of that door was going to change our lives forever. For better or worse, there was no turning back now. The door swung open, and I steeled myself for whatever was to come. Little did I know, the real bombshells were yet to drop, and the path ahead would test me in ways I never thought possible. As the door swung open, I held my breath. Dean Hawthorne stood there, looking tired and disheveled, a far cry from his usual polished appearance. "Thank God you're all safe," he said, stepping inside. "We don't have much time. They're on to us." Eric's eyes narrowed. "Us? What do you mean, us?" The dean sighed heavily. "I've been trying to expose this corruption for months. When I realized what you were up to, I did my best to protect you without blowing my cover. My journalistic instincts kicked in. So you're the one who sent us that email. Help coming?" He nodded. I couldn't risk direct communication, but when I heard they were planning to neutralize the threat, I knew I had to act. Sarah spoke up, her voice shaking slightly. "How do we know we can trust you?" Dean Hawthorne reached into his jacket and pulled out a USB drive. "Because I have everything you need to blow this wide open. Financial records, email trails, even recorded conversations. It's all here." Eric took the drive, his face a mix of hope and suspicion. "If you have all this, why haven't you gone public already?" "Because it goes higher than you can imagine," the dean replied grimly. "Politicians, judges, even federal agents are involved. I needed allies I could trust before making a move." I felt a chill run down my spine. How high are we talking?" Before he could answer, we heard the sound of vehicles approaching. The dean's face paled. "They found us. We need to go. Now." We grabbed our things and rushed out the back door. As we ran towards the woods behind the cabin, I heard shouts and the sound of doors slamming. "This way," the dean hissed, leading us down a barely visible path. We stumbled through the underbrush, branches whipping at our faces. I could hear footsteps behind us, getting closer. Suddenly, Eric stumbled, crying out in pain. "My ankle! I think it's sprained." I helped him up, draping his arm over my shoulder. "Come on, we can't stop now." We pushed on, but Eric was slowing us down. The voices behind us were getting louder. "There's an old ranger station about half a mile ahead," the dean panted. "If we can make it there, we might have a chance." But as we rounded a bend in the path, we found our way blocked by two men in dark suits. They weren't even out of breath. "End of the line," one of them said, pulling out a gun. I felt Eric tense beside me. The dean stepped forward, his hands raised. "Now, gentlemen, let's not do anything rash." The man with the gun smirked. "Sorry, Dean, orders are orders." Time seemed to slow down. I saw the man's finger tighten on the trigger. Without thinking, I shoved Eric to the ground. Hearing the deafening crack of the gunshot, pain exploded in my shoulder and I stumbled, falling to my knees. I heard Eric shouting my name, felt his arms around me. Then chaos erupted. More shots rang out, but not from the men in suits. They fell, revealing a group of people behind them, guns raised. "Federal agents!" a woman's voice shouted. "Everyone down!" As agents swarmed the area, securing the men in suits and checking on us, I felt myself growing dizzy. The last thing I remember was Eric's face hovering over me, his eyes filled with fear and love. "Stay with me, Sophia," he pleaded. "Help is here. You're going to be okay." Then everything went black. I woke up in a hospital room, the steady beep of monitors filling the air. Eric was asleep in a chair beside my bed, his hand clasping mine. As I stirred, he jerked awake. "Sophia, thank God. How are you feeling?" I tried to sit up, wincing at the pain in my shoulder. "Like I've been shot. What happened? Where are the others?" Eric's face was a mix of relief and worry. "You've been out for 2 days. The bullet missed anything vital, but you lost a lot of blood. As for the others..." He was interrupted by a knock at the door. A woman in a sharp suit entered, flanked by 2 agents. "Mrs. Anderson, I'm Agent Cortez with the FBI. We need to talk." Over the next hour, Agent Cortez filled us in. The corruption we'd uncovered was just the tip of the iceberg. It stretched across multiple states, involving politicians, business leaders, and even some federal agents. Your investigation, combined with Dean Hawthorne's evidence, has given us what we need to bring down the entire network, she explained. I felt a mix of pride and disbelief. So it's over. Agent Cortez's expression turned serious. Not quite. We've made significant arrests, but some key players are still at large, which brings me to why I'm here. She leaned forward, her voice low. We need your help to finish this, both of you. Your knowledge of the case, combined with Mrs. Anderson's investigative skills, could be crucial in tying up loose ends. Eric squeezed my hand. It's your call, Sophia. You've already been through so much. I thought about everything we'd been through, the suspicions, the fear, the pain, but I also thought about the truth we'd uncovered, the corruption we'd exposed. Looking Agent Cortez in the eye, I nodded. We're in. Whatever it takes to see this through. As Agent Cortez left to make arrangements, Eric turned to me, his eyes shining with a mix of pride and concern. Are you sure about this? He asked softly. I reached up, touching his cheek. I'm sure. We started this together. We'll finish it together. As Eric leaned in to kiss me, I felt a surge of determination. We had a long road ahead, full of challenges and potential dangers. But for the first time in months, I felt truly connected to my husband, united in a common purpose. Little did I know, the biggest challenges and the most shocking revelations were yet to come. Our journey was far from over, and the truth we were about to uncover would shake us to our very core. The next few weeks were a blur of debriefings, strategy meetings, and sleepless nights. As I recovered from my gunshot wound, Eric and I worked closely with Agent Cortez and her team, piecing together the complex web of corruption we'd stumbled into. But despite the progress we were making, I couldn't shake a growing sense of unease. Something about the whole situation felt off. One night, as Eric and I were poring over documents in our safe house, I finally voiced my concerns. Eric, I said, pushing away from the table. Does any of this feel strange to you? He looked up, frowning. What do you mean? I gestured at the piles of papers surrounding us. All of this. The convenient timing of the FBI showing up, the way they're so eager to work with us. It doesn't add up. Eric sighed, rubbing his eyes. Sophia, we've been over this. Agent Cortez explained that they'd been building a case for months. Our investigation just gave them the final pieces they needed. I shook my head, frustrated. I know, but my words were cut off by a sharp knock at the door. We froze, exchanging worried glances. We weren't expecting anyone. Eric moved towards the door cautiously, while I reached for the panic button Agent Cortez had given us. But before either of us could act, the door burst open. To our shock, Sarah stumbled in, looking pale and terrified. Sarah, I gasped. What are you doing here? How did you find us? She collapsed into a chair, her hands shaking. I'm so sorry, she whispered. I didn't know. I never meant for any of this to happen. Eric knelt beside her, his face etched with concern. Sarah, what are you talking about? What's going on? She looked up at us, tears streaming down her face. It's all a lie. The FBI, the investigation, all of it. We've been played from the start. I felt my blood run cold. What do you mean, played? Sarah took a deep breath, trying to compose herself. I was approached months ago by a group calling themselves the Guardians. They said they were a watchdog organization dedicated to exposing corruption in higher education. They wanted me to get close to you, Eric, to help uncover the financial irregularities at the university. Eric's face hardened. So you've been spying on us this whole time? She nodded miserably. At first, I thought I was doing the right thing, but then I started noticing inconsistencies. The information they were feeding me didn't match what we were finding. And when you got shot, Sophia, I knew something was very wrong. I leaned forward, my mind racing. So who are these guardians, really? Sarah shook her head. I'm not sure, but I don't think they're who they claim to be. I think they might be part of the very corruption we thought we were exposing. The room fell silent as we absorbed this bombshell. Everything we thought we knew, everything we'd been fighting for, suddenly felt like a house of cards ready to collapse. Eric was the first to speak. We need to get out of here. If what Sarah's saying is true, we're not safe. I nodded, already moving to gather our things, but as I reached for my laptop, a thought struck me. Wait, I said, turning to Sarah. How do we know we can trust you? This could be another trick. Sarah's eyes filled with fresh tears. I know I've given you no reason to trust me, but I swear I'm telling the truth. I care about both of you. I couldn't live with myself if something happened to you because of me. I searched her face, looking for any sign of deception, but all I saw was genuine fear and remorse. Okay, I said finally, but from now on, no more secrets. We're in this together. As we hurriedly packed our belongings, my mind was in turmoil. If we couldn't trust the FBI, who could we trust? How deep did this deception go? We were about to leave when my phone buzzed with a text. It was from Agent Cortez. Urgent meeting, come to the office immediately. I showed the message to Eric and Sarah. What do we do? Eric's jaw clenched. We can't go. It could be a trap. But Sarah shook her head. If we don't show up, they'll know something's wrong. They'll come looking for us. I took a deep breath, making a decision. We go, but we're careful. At the first sign of trouble, we get out. The drive to the FBI office was tense. Every car that passed us, every pedestrian on the street suddenly seemed like a potential threat. As we walked into the building, I felt like we were entering the lion's den. Agent Cortez greeted us with a smile that now seemed predatory rather than reassuring. Thank you for coming so quickly, she said, leading us to a conference room. We've had a major breakthrough in the case. As she began to outline new evidence they'd uncovered, I watched her closely, looking for any sign that she knew we were onto them. But her demeanor remained professional, her explanations detailed and convincing. For a moment, I felt a flicker of doubt. Had Sarah been mistaken? Were we paranoid for no reason? But then I noticed something, a small tell, so subtle I almost missed it. Every time Agent Cortez mentioned a key piece of evidence, her left eye twitched slightly. It was the same tick I'd noticed when she first debriefed us in the hospital, when she was lying about how they'd found us. In that moment, I knew Sarah was right. We were in the heart of the deception. As Agent Cortez continued talking, I caught Eric's eye. A silent message passed between us. We needed to get out of here and fast. But as I opened my mouth to make an excuse for us to leave, the door to the conference room burst open. A team of armed agents poured in, guns raised. "Nobody move!" one of them shouted. "You're all under arrest for obstruction of justice and interfering with a federal investigation." As they handcuffed us, I locked eyes with Eric. The fear and confusion I saw there mirrored my own. How had it come to this? And more importantly, how were we going to get out of it? Little did I know, this was just the beginning of our darkest hour. The truth we were about to uncover would shake us to our very core, testing our love, our trust, and our very will to survive. As the cold metal of the handcuffs bit into my wrists, I felt a strange sense of calm wash over me. This was it, the moment where everything could fall apart or where we could finally uncover the truth. I looked at Eric, his face a mask of determination, and I knew we weren't going down without a fight. They separated us, putting Eric and Sarah in one interrogation room and me in another. As I sat there, staring at my reflection in the two-way mirror, I realized this was my chance. If I was going to turn the tables, it had to be now. Hours passed. They were trying to break me down with silence and isolation. But I'm a journalist. Patience is my game. Finally, the door opened, and Agent Cortez walked in. "Mrs. Anderson," she said, her voice dripping with false sympathy. "I hope you understand the gravity of your situation. Obstruction of justice is a serious charge." I leaned forward, meeting her gaze. "Cut the act, Cortez. We both know this isn't about justice." Her eye twitched, that tell I'd noticed earlier. "I'm not sure what you mean." "Oh, I think you do," I replied, my voice steady. "The Guardians, Project Prometheus, it all leads back to you, doesn't it?" For a split second, I saw a flicker of surprise in her eyes. Then her mask slipped back into place. "You're delusional, Mrs. Anderson. The stress of the investigation must be getting to you." But I pressed on. "You know what I think. I think the Guardians aren't some watchdog group. They're the ones behind the corruption, and you're their inside man, or woman, I should say." Cortez's composure cracked. Her hand slammed down on the table. "You have no idea what you're talking about." I smiled, knowing I'd struck a nerve. "Don't I? Let's talk about that night at the cabin. Those weren't rogue agents trying to silence us. They were your people, making sure we'd trust you when you rescued us." She stared at me, her face unreadable. Then, to my surprise, she started to laugh. Well, it seems we underestimated you, Sophia. I didn't think you'd put it together so quickly." My heart raced, but I kept my voice calm. "So, what now? You can't exactly arrest us for uncovering your own corruption." Cortez leaned back, a smirk playing on her lips. "Oh, I think you'll find we can do whatever we want. You see, the Guardians. We're not just some small-time operation. We have reach you can't even imagine." "Why?" I asked, genuinely curious. "What's the end game here?" She chuckled. "Power, of course. Money, influence, the usual. But on a scale you can't comprehend. Universities are just the beginning. We have our fingers in everything. Politics, industry, even international relations." As she spoke, I subtly shifted in my chair, feeling for the small recording device I'd managed to hide before we left the safe house. I prayed it was working. "So what happens to us now?" I asked, trying to keep her talking. Cortez shrugged. "That depends on you. You're smart, Sophia. Resourceful. We could use someone like you." I stared at her in disbelief. "You're offering me a job after everything you've done?" "Think about it," she said, leaning forward. "You could have everything you've ever wanted. Money, power, influence. All you have to do is join us." For a moment, I let myself imagine it. The resources I'd have at my disposal, the stories I could uncover or bury. But then I thought of Eric, of the trust we'd rebuilt, of the truth we'd fought so hard to expose. I shook my head. "Sorry, Cortez, I'm not interested in joining your little club." Her face hardened. "That's unfortunate. In that case." But before she could finish, the door burst open. To my shock, it was Dean Hawthorne, flanked by a team of agents, real agents this time. "Agent Cortez," he said, his voice filled with authority. "You're under arrest for corruption, conspiracy, and a whole list of other charges I look forward to reading out in court." As they cuffed Cortez, who was sputtering in disbelief, Dean turned to me with a wink. "Told you help was coming, didn't I?" The next few hours were a whirlwind. Eric and Sarah were released, and we learned the full story. Dean Hawthorne had been working with a special task force, investigating the Guardians for months. Our investigation had provided the final piece of evidence they needed. As we sat in a real FBI office, being debriefed by actual agents, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. It was over. We'd won. Eric squeezed my hand, his eyes shining with pride and love. "You did it, Sophia. You cracked the case wide open." I shook my head, smiling. We did it together. Months passed. The trial was a media sensation, with Eric and I at the center of it all. The Guardianism network was dismantled, corrupt officials were arrested, and a massive overhaul of university funding systems was implemented nationwide. As for us, well, Eric and I emerged stronger than ever. Our shared ordeal had rekindled a spark we thought we'd lost. We decided to take a sabbatical, traveling the world and reconnecting with each other. One evening, as we sat on a beach in Bali watching the sunset, Eric turned to me with a serious expression. "Sophia," he said, taking my hand, "I know these past months have been crazy, but they've made me realize something." I raised an eyebrow, curious. "Oh, what's that?" He smiled, his eyes full of love. "That there's no one else I'd rather face life's challenges with than you. You're not just my wife, you're my partner, my best friend, my everything." Tears welled up in my eyes as he continued. "So, Sophia Anderson, will you marry me again?" I laughed through my tears, pulling him close. "Yes, you big goof. 1,000 times yes." As we kissed, the sun dipping below the horizon, I marveled at the journey we'd been through. From suspicion and heartbreak to danger and triumph, we'd faced it all together. And now, as we looked to the future, I knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, we'd face them the same way, side by side, stronger together than we ever were apart. The end, or perhaps just the beginning of our next great adventure.